Sherlock Holmes and The Mystery of the Obsidian Mirror. Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet Cornian mirror. Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where the world slows its relentless pace and mysteries unfold. Not with urgency, but with the gentle inevitability of twilight settling over ancient stones. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight. This is a place for rest, for letting go of the day's demands, where stories are told not to startle or alarm, but to guide you softly into that peaceful realm between waking and dreaming. Tonight's tale is one of shadows and secrets, of Victorian London wrapped in November mist, of a detective whose mind never rests, but whose voice, when it reaches us across the years, carries the cadence of rain against window panes. Let the words wash over you, let your breathing deepen, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be, but here, now, sinking into comfort as we journey together through gaslit streets and candlelit chambers. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The year was 1893, and London wore its autumn like a gentleman's overcoat, elegant and heavy with the weight of coming winter. On this particular November evening, the 23rd to be precise, the city seemed to breathe its own rhythm, slow and contemplative, as fog rolled in from the Thames and settled over cobblestones still damp from afternoon rain. In the rooms at 221 B. Baker Street, a fire crackled softly in the hearth, its amber light dancing across worn Persian rugs and the spines of countless volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The scent of tobacco hung gently in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of Mrs. Hudson's Earl Grey tea, which sat cooling in delicate china cups upon the cluttered side table. Sherlock Holmes stood by the window, his tall silhouette framed against the gaslit street beyond, one hand resting thoughtfully against the dark wood of the window frame. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, watching the fog swirl and eddy around the street lamps below, his grey eyes distant with that particular quality of attention I had come to recognize over our years of friendship. It was not the restless energy that sometimes seized him between cases, that fevered impatience that drove him to scrape at his violin or pace the rooms like a caged panther. No, this was something else entirely, a deep contemplation, as if he were listening to some melody only he could hear, some pattern in the very fabric of the evening itself. I sat in my accustomed armchair by the fire, my own thoughts drifting pleasantly between the pages of the evening paper and the comfortable warmth that radiated from the hearth. Outside, I could hear the muffled clip-clop of a hansom cab passing by, the distant call of a street vendor closing up his stand for the night, the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the plane trees that lined our street. London's evening song, familiar and soothing, a lullaby for a city settling into its nightly rest. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice quiet, almost meditative, "do you believe in mirrors?" The question hung in the air between us, crafting Sherlock Holmes. Mystery continuation strategically, Morninsory detail. Morning arrived with that peculiar quality of light that November brings to London, pale and diffuse, as though the sun itself hesitated to fully commit to the day. I woke to find Holmes already dressed, standing at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee in one hand and the professor's journal open before him, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages as he absorbed every detail of Edmund Ashworth's meticulous research. The aroma of Mrs. Hudson's breakfast filled our rooms, eggs and toast and strong coffee, grounding us in the comfortable routines of the ordinary world, before we ventured into realms of mystery and shadow. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said, without looking up, "I trust you slept well. We have a train to catch at 10:45 from King's Cross. I have already sent a telegram to Miss Ashworth, informing her of our arrival this evening. Pack warmly, my friend. Northumberland in November is not kind to those unprepared for its particular brand of cold." The journey north unfolded with the gentle, rocking rhythm that only train travel can provide. That peculiar motion that seems designed to lull the mind into a state between alertness and dreaming. We had secured a private compartment, and as London's endless sprawl of buildings gradually gave way to countryside, Holmes sat absorbed in the professor's journal, occasionally making notes in his own neat hand, while I watched the landscape transform outside our window. The sky hung low and grey, heavy with the promise of rain, and the fields rolled past in shades of brown and faded green, dotted here and there with sheep that looked like scattered stones against the darker earth. The train's wheels created their own music, a steady clicking rhythm over the rails, punctuated by the occasional whistle as we passed through small stations, their names called out by conductors in voices made distant by fog and steam. Peterborough, Doncaster, York. Each name a marker on our journey northward, each station a moment of stillness before the train gathered its momentum once more and carried us deeper into the countryside, away from the familiar and toward the unknown. Holmes finally closed the journal as we passed Durham, the cathedral's towers rising like ancient sentinels through the mist, and he turned to gaze out the window, his expression thoughtful. "Professor Ashworth was a man of considerable learning," he said, quietly, his voice nearly lost beneath the sound of the train. "His research into the mirror's origins is thorough, methodical. He traced references to obsidian mirrors through various cultures, Aztec divination tools, Tibetan sacred objects, Mediterranean mystery cult artifacts. But this particular mirror seems to predate all known examples. The symbols carved into its frame are not from any recognized language or system of writing." I leaned forward with interest. What did he conclude? That is the fascinating part, Watson. He did not conclude. His final entries become increasingly troubled. He writes of dreams, of visions seen in the mirror's surface, of voices heard in the deep of night. Yet he never succumbs to superstition. Even in his final entry, written merely 3 days before his death, he insists there must be a rational explanation, some property of the obsidian itself, some trick of light and reflection that creates these phenomena. He was determined to discover the truth. The train swayed gently as we rounded a curve, and I caught a glimpse of the sea in the distance, dark and restless beneath the grey sky. The conductor passed through our carriage, calling out the next station, his voice carrying that sing-song quality peculiar to men who have repeated the same words thousands of times until they become almost a meditation. We changed trains at Newcastle, stepping out onto a platform swept by cold wind that carried the salt scent of the North Sea. The station was busy with afternoon travellers, their voices creating a low murmur of conversation that blended with the hiss of steam and the calls of vendors selling hot chestnuts and newspapers. Holmes procured us both cups of strong tea from a small kiosk, and we stood on the platform, warming our hands on the china cups, watching the bustle of provincial life flow around us like water around stones in a stream. The local train that would take us to the small village nearest Ashworth Hall was older, more intimate than the express we had travelled on from London. We shared our compartment with a farmer bringing chickens to market, their soft clucking providing an unexpectedly soothing counterpoint to the train's motion, and an elderly woman dressed in black who knitted steadily, her needles clicking in perfect rhythm with the wheels on the tracks. The landscape grew wilder as we travelled, the gentle rolling hills giving way to more rugged terrain, moorland stretching away toward distant hills that wore their autumn colours like faded tapestries. Stone walls divided the fields, ancient and weathered, built by hands long turned to dust, and here and there stood the ruins of old abbeys and towers, remnants of a time when this land had been contested by kingdoms and clans, when every hilltop held a fortress, and every valley hid its secrets. Darkness was beginning to fall when we finally reached our destination, a small station that seemed to consist of little more than a platform and a tiny shelter. Miss Ashworth herself was waiting for us, wrapped in a heavy cloak, standing beside a carriage drawn by two sturdy horses who stamped their feet against the cold. The station master helped with our luggage, touching his cap respectfully as Holmes pressed a coin into his hand, and then we were climbing into the carriage, settling onto leather seats that creaked softly in the gathering dusk. "Thank you for coming so quickly, gentlemen," Miss Ashworth said, as the carriage lurched into motion, the horses' hooves finding their rhythm on the country road. "I confess I have slept poorly since sending that telegram. The hall feels different now, knowing what lies within it, knowing the strangeness that my uncle documented in those pages." The road wound through countryside that seemed untouched by the modern age, past stone cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys, past a small church with a graveyard where ancient headstones leaned at angles, like old men telling secrets to the earth. The sky had deepened to that particular shade of blue that comes just before full darkness, and the first stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant in the vast expanse above. Then, rounding a bend in the road, we saw it, Ashworth Hall rising before us like something from a Gothic romance, all dark stone and peaked roofs, towers and turrets silhouetted against the deepening sky. Windows glowed with warm lamplight here and there, but many more remained dark, and the overall impression was of a place that had grown too large for its current inhabitants, a house built for an age of extended families and grand gatherings, now echoing with emptiness and the weight of accumulated years. The carriage wheels crunched on gravel as we approached, up a long drive lined with ancient oaks, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like supplicating hands. As we drew closer, I could make out more details. The ivy climbing the western wall, the stone gargoyles perched at the corners of the roof, their weathered faces watching our approach with expressions frozen between warning and welcome, the heavy oak door studded with iron that marked the main entrance. A gust of wind swept across the grounds as the carriage came to a halt, sending dried leaves skittering across the gravel and causing the horses to shift nervously in their traces. Somewhere in the distance, I heard what might have been an owl calling, or perhaps simply the wind finding voice in the eaves and corners of this ancient pile. "Welcome to Ashworth Hall, gentlemen," Miss Ashworth said softly, as a butler emerged to take our bags. "I hope you will find your stay enlightening." We stepped down from the carriage, and I felt the full weight of the place settle over me like a physical thing. This was a house that had known centuries of life, of births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, secrets whispered in darkened corridors, and truths spoken before roaring fires. The very stones seemed to hold memory, and I understood suddenly why Professor Ashworth had chosen to spend his final years here, surrounded by this tangible connection to the past. The entrance hall was vast, floored with black and white marble that created a checkerboard pattern leading toward a grand staircase that split and curved upward to the floors above. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashworths gazing down with varying expressions of severity and benevolence, their eyes seeming to follow us as we moved through their domain. A fire burned in an enormous hearth, but its warmth seemed unable to fully dispel the chill that permeated the space. "I have prepared rooms for you in the east wing," Miss Ashworth said, leading us toward the staircase. "They overlook the gardens and should be quite comfortable. My uncle's study, where the mirror currently resides, is in the west tower. I thought perhaps after you have refreshed yourselves from your journey, we might take dinner, and then—" She paused, her hand resting lightly on the banister. "Then, if you are willing, I should like to show you the mirror itself." We followed her up the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the vast space, past more portraits and tapestries that depicted hunting scenes and battles from centuries past. The corridor of the east wing was narrower, more intimate, lit by gas lamps that cast a warm, flickering glow across dark wood panelling. Miss Ashworth showed us to adjacent rooms, both furnished with heavy oak furniture that spoke of quality and age, with fires already burning cheerfully in their grates. "Dinner will be served at 8 in the small dining room," she said, pausing at my door. "I hope you will find everything to your satisfaction. If you require anything, please ring. The staff are few, but they are attentive." With that, she withdrew, leaving Holmes and me to settle into our temporary quarters. I stood for a moment at my window, looking out over the darkened gardens below. A fountain stood at the centre of what appeared to be a formal garden, its water still now in the cold, and beyond that, I could just make out the shapes of yew hedges forming a maze or labyrinth of some kind. The moon was rising, nearly full, casting silver light across the scene, and I remembered Miss Ashworth's mention of her uncle's journal, warning against viewing the mirror when the moon was full. A soft knock at the connecting door between our rooms drew my attention, and Holmes entered, already changed for dinner, his expression thoughtful. "An impressive establishment," he said, joining me at the window, "and one that holds more secrets than merely that obsidian mirror, I suspect. Did you notice the family portraits, Watson? Several gaps in the sequence, frames removed or faces painted over. There is something in this family's history that someone has taken pains to obscure." Before I could respond, a distant sound reached us, echoing through the old house. The deep, resonant toll of a bell, calling us to dinner, its voice reverberating through stone and wood, marking the passage of time in this place, where past and present seemed to exist in uneasy communion. Holmes turned from the window, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Come, Watson, let us dine and gather our strength, for tonight, I suspect, we shall look into the depths of the obsidian mirror, and perhaps it shall look back into us." Candlelight transformed the small dining room into something almost otherworldly, shadows dancing across walls panelled in dark mahogany, the flames from D-panelled in dark mahogany. the flames from dozens of candles reflecting in polished silver and crystal, until the room seemed filled with stars. We sat at one end of a table that could have accommodated 20, Miss Ashworth at the head, Holmes and I on either side, while servants moved like ghosts through the dimness, placing dishes before us with such quiet efficiency that one barely noticed their presence until a new course appeared, as if by magic. The meal itself was surprisingly excellent, considering the remote location. A delicate soup of autumn vegetables, followed by roasted pheasant with root vegetables that had clearly been pulled from the estate's own gardens that very day, their earthy sweetness perfectly complementing the rich meat. Wine flowed into our glasses, a burgundy that caught the candlelight and glowed like liquid rubies. And for a time we ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the gentle clink of silverware against porcelain, and the occasional crackle from the fire burning in the room's hearth. Miss Ashworth seemed more at ease here than she had appeared in London, perhaps finding comfort in the familiar surroundings, despite the strangeness that had brought us to her door. She wore a gown of deep green that suited her colouring, and her auburn hair was arranged in a simple style that spoke more of practicality than fashion, as befitted a woman living alone in such a remote location. "Tell me," Holmes said eventually, setting down his wineglass with deliberate care, "about your uncle's final days. The journal entries become sparse toward the end, as if he were too preoccupied to maintain his usual meticulous records. Did you notice any change in his behaviour, his habits?" Miss Ashworth considered the question, while a servant removed our plates and replaced them with a course of local cheese and fruit, arranging them on the table with the precision of an artist composing a still life. "I visited 3 times during the last 6 months of his life," she said slowly, her fingers tracing the stem of her wineglass. "Each time, I found him more withdrawn, more consumed by his research. He had always been somewhat solitary by nature, you understand. But this was different. He would spend entire nights in the study with the mirror, emerging only when dawn broke, exhausted but exhilarated, claiming to be on the verge of some great discovery." The fire popped softly, sending up a shower of sparks that died before reaching the blackened stones of the chimney. Outside, the wind had risen, and I could hear it testing the windows, seeking entry, carrying with it the scent of rain and wild moorland. "Did he speak of what he hoped to discover?" I asked, accepting a small portion of Stilton that smelled wonderfully sharp and complex. "Only in the vaguest terms," Miss Ashworth replied. "He believed the mirror was a tool of some kind, created for purposes we had forgotten, not merely for reflection, but for perception, for seeing what lies beneath the surface of things, what we hide even from ourselves. He spoke of ancient wisdom, of knowledge that had been deliberately concealed because humanity was not ready for it." She paused, her expression troubled. Toward the very end, he spoke of faces in the mirror, people he recognized from the family portraits, ancestors long dead, watching him from within that dark surface. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of deep contemplation. "And his death, the circumstances were natural. The physician said it was his heart," Miss Ashworth answered quietly. "He was found in the study one morning, collapsed before the mirror, his journal open beside him. There were no signs of violence, no indication of foul play. Simply an old man whose heart had finally given out under the strain of..." She hesitated, under the strain of whatever he had witnessed in those final hours. A servant entered to pour more wine, and in the moment of distraction, I noticed Holmes's gaze drift toward the doorway, toward the corridor. Beyond that would lead, eventually, to the West Tower and its mysterious occupant. The candlelight caught his profile, emphasizing the sharp intelligence in his eyes, the intensity of focus that made him both the most brilliant and most solitary man I had ever known. We finished our meal with a delicate pudding that tasted of autumn apples and cinnamon, accompanied by a sweet wine that warmed pleasantly as it went down. Throughout, the conversation drifted to less troubling topics: the history of the hall, the neighbouring estates, the character of the local village. Yet beneath it all, I felt the presence of the mirror, waiting in its tower room, patient and inevitable, like a question that demanded to be answered. At last, Miss Ashworth rose, setting her napkin beside her plate with a gesture of finality. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor I detected in her hands, "if you are ready, I believe it is time to show you what you have travelled so far to see." We followed her from the dining room, back through corridors lit by gas lamps that hissed softly as we passed, their light creating pools of illumination separated by stretches of shadow. The house seemed larger at night, more labyrinthine, as if corridors had multiplied in the darkness, and doorways led to rooms that had not existed in daylight. Our footsteps echoed on wooden floors, then were muffled by carpet, then echoed again on stone as we entered the older parts of the structure. The West Tower was reached through a narrow passageway that felt distinctly medieval. The walls here constructed of rough stone blocks that predated the more refined architecture of the later additions. A spiral staircase wound upward, lit by candles set in iron sconces, their flames streaming sideways in draughts that found their way through cracks in the ancient masonry. We climbed in single file, Miss Ashworth leading with a candle of her own, her shadow preceding us up the curving stairs like a dark herald announcing our approach. The temperature dropped as we ascended, our breath beginning to mist in the cold air, and I pulled my coat more tightly around myself, grateful for Holmes's advice to dress warmly. At the top of the stairs, a heavy oak door stood closed, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the uncertain light. Miss Ashworth paused with her hand on the iron handle, looking back at us with an expression I could not quite read. "Once we enter," she said quietly, "I ask that you observe carefully, but touch nothing without consulting Mr. Holmes first. My uncle's notes contain warnings, and while I do not pretend to understand the nature of what we face, I believe caution is warranted." Holmes nodded his agreement, his expression intent, and Miss Ashworth turned the handle. The door swung inward with a low creak that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the tower, and we stepped across the threshold into Professor Edmund Ashworth's final sanctuary. The study was circular, following the tower's shape, its walls lined entirely with bookshelves that rose from floor to ceiling. Thousands of volumes created a mosaic of leather and cloth bindings, their spines bearing titles in dozens of languages: Latin, Greek, Arabic, Sanskrit, and many I could not identify. A desk stood near one of the narrow windows, its surface covered with papers and opened books. A pair of spectacles resting atop a half-finished letter, as if the writer had merely stepped away for a moment and would return at any instant. But dominating the room impossible to ignore despite one's desire to look elsewhere, stood the obsidian mirror. It rose from floor nearly to ceiling, perhaps 7 feet in height, its frame carved from black stone that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. The obsidian had been worked with extraordinary skill, every inch covered in intricate patterns and symbols that seemed to move as one watched, as if the stone itself were liquid, slowly flowing, rearranging itself in patterns that almost made sense before dissolving into new configurations. The mirror's surface was like no glass I had ever seen. It did not simply reflect the room around it. Rather, it seemed to present a version of the room that existed slightly askew from reality, as if viewed from an angle that should not be possible. The books on the shelves appeared in the mirror, but their titles were different, or in different languages, or perhaps written backwards in a way that hurt the eyes to decipher. The candles reflected, but their flames burned in colours that had no names, hues between the familiar spectrum that the mind struggled to process. And in the very centre of that dark surface, barely visible, was something else entirely. A depth that suggested the mirror was not a mirror at all, but a window, a portal, an opening into spaces that extended far beyond the physical dimensions of the tower, far beyond the laws that governed the solid world of stone and wood and flesh. Holmes approached it slowly, his scientist's curiosity overcoming any instinctive wariness, until he stood mere feet from that obsidian surface. I watched his reflection appear in the dark glass, but it was not quite right, not quite the Holmes I knew. The reflection seemed older somehow, or younger, or perhaps both at once, as if the mirror showed not just what was, but what had been, and what might yet be. "Extraordinary," Holmes murmured, his voice carrying a note of genuine wonder that I rarely heard from him. The craftsmanship alone is beyond anything in the British Museum. But the effect, Watson, the optical properties of this material, I have never encountered anything remotely similar. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook, beginning to sketch the symbols on the frame with quick, precise strokes. As he worked, I found my own gaze drawn to the mirror's surface, to that impossible depth that seemed to beckon, to promise revelation. If only one looked long enough, deep enough, past the surface reflection into the darkness beyond. A sound broke the spell, sudden and sharp in the quiet of the tower room, the crash of breaking porcelain. We turned to see Miss Ashworth standing frozen, a teacup shattered at her feet, tea spreading in a dark stain across the wooden floor. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide and fixed on the mirror. "I saw," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just for a moment, in the reflection, there was someone else in the room with us, a man in old-fashioned dress, standing behind you, Mr. Holmes, reaching toward you as if to touch your shoulder. We all turned to look at the mirror again, but saw only our own reflections, distorted and strange in that dark surface. 3 figures in a tower room, surrounded by ancient knowledge and gathering shadows, while outside the window, the moon continued its slow climb toward fullness, flooding the study with silver light that made the obsidian frame seem to pulse with a life of its own. Holmes remained perfectly still for several heartbeats after Miss Ashworth's revelation, his gaze fixed upon the mirror's depths, with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the obsidian surface into whatever mysteries lay beyond. The broken teacup rested forgotten on the floor, fragments of porcelain scattered like bones cast for divination. the spilled tea spreading its dark stain across ancient floorboards that had witnessed centuries of footsteps and secrets. I moved to Miss Ashworth's side, offering her my handkerchief and a steadying hand on her elbow, for she swayed slightly, as if the vision had drained something vital from her. "Describe exactly what you saw," Holmes said, his tone gentle but precise, the voice of a physician taking symptoms rather than an interrogator demanding answers. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem, the clothing, the posture, the expression on the face. Did the figure move? Did it speak? Miss Ashworth drew a shaky breath, accepting my support gratefully. It was there for perhaps 3 seconds, no more. A man, yes, wearing what appeared to be clothing from the early 18th century. A long coat with many buttons, breeches, a wig of the sort gentlemen wore in that period. His face was turned toward you, Mr. Holmes, and his hand was extended as if to place it upon your shoulder. But there was something about his expression, something desperate, pleading, as if he wished to communicate something of terrible importance, but had no voice with which to speak. Holmes turned from the mirror and crossed to the professor's desk, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. He picked up the spectacles resting there, holding them up to the candlelight, examining them as if they might contain some residue of their owner's final thoughts. And when you looked again, the figure had vanished. Completely, Miss Ashworth confirmed, her voice steadier now, as if it had never been there at all. Yet, I know what I saw, gentlemen. I am not given to flights of fancy or nervous imaginings. I do not doubt it, Holmes replied, setting down the spectacles and beginning to sort through the papers on the desk. The human mind is a remarkable instrument, capable of perceiving things that our conscious awareness refuses to acknowledge. But whether what you perceived was an actual presence, or some trick of light and shadow, some property of the mirror's construction designed to create such illusions, that remains to be determined. I glanced back at the mirror, half expecting to see the mysterious figure materialize once more, but the surface showed only our reflections in that strange, distorted way. The room behind us rendered in impossible perspectives that made one's eyes water if examined too closely. The moonlight streaming through the tower window created patterns on the floor, geometric shapes that seemed to align with symbols carved into the obsidian frame, as if moon and mirror were engaged in some silent conversation, some exchange of information in a language written in light and shadow. Holmes had found what he was searching for, the professor's journal, the same one we had examined on the train, but now accompanied by several loose sheets of paper, covered in cramped handwriting that grew increasingly agitated as the entries progressed. He carried these to a reading stand near one of the candles and began to study them with complete absorption, his finger tracing lines of text while his lips moved silently, forming words that the professor had written in his final days. "Listen to this," Holmes said, after several minutes of concentrated reading. An entry from 2 weeks before Professor Ashworth's death. "The mirror does not reflect what is, but what was, and what might be. Tonight, I saw my father's face looking back at me, though he has been dead these 20 years. He mouthed words I could not hear, but I understood their meaning. Turn back. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Yet how can I turn back now, when I stand at the very threshold of understanding?" The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the tower windows with increasing insistence. And somewhere far below in the house I heard a door slam, the sound echoing up through the stone passages like a warning, like the house itself expressing displeasure at our intrusion into its deepest secrets. Miss Ashworth moved to warm herself by a small brazier that stood in the corner, its coals glowing like a dragon's eye in the dimness. "My uncle was not a man easily frightened," she said quietly. "For him to write such things, to speak of turning back, suggests he encountered something that genuinely disturbed him, yet he continued his research until the very end." Holmes nodded, turning another page. "Indeed, and here, from his final week, I have begun to understand the mechanism. The obsidian is not merely stone, but something else, some mineral formation that exists partially in our world, and partially in elsewhere. The symbols carved into the frame are not decorative, but functional, a kind of equation or formula that maintains a balance between states of being. When certain conditions are met, when the moon reaches fullness, when the observer's mind achieves a particular state of receptivity, the barrier thins, and what lies beyond becomes visible, becomes accessible." A sharp crack interrupted Holmes's reading, causing us all to start. One of the shelves had given way under the weight of its ancient volumes, spilling perhaps a dozen books to the floor with a sound like thunder in the confined space of the tower. Dust rose in clouds, dancing in the moonlight, and as it settled, I noticed something peculiar. The fallen books had arranged themselves in a pattern, a rough circle with one volume at its center, opened to a page that bore an illustration remarkably similar to the obsidian mirror before us. Holmes was beside the fallen books in an instant, kneeling to examine them without disturbing their arrangement. "Watson, bring a candle here, if you would," he said, his voice tight with excitement. I complied, holding the flame close so he could study the illustration more clearly. The drawing was crude compared to the reality of the mirror, executed in ink that had faded to brown with age, but the essential elements were unmistakable. The obsidian frame, the symbols, and beneath it, text in what appeared to be Latin. Holmes began to read aloud, translating as he went. "The Mirror of Becoming, wrought in the year of our Lord 1712, by Marcus Ashworth, upon his return from the Levant, where he had studied with masters of the hidden arts. Let it be known that this glass shows not the face one wears, but the face one conceals, not the soul one professes, but the soul one possesses. Let those who gaze upon it be prepared to see truth unvarnished by self-deception or social pretense." He paused, his finger resting on the text. There is more. Yet Marcus came to fear what he had wrought, for the mirror showed him not only his own hidden nature, but the hidden natures of those long departed, as if it pierced not merely the veil of self-deception, but the veil between life and death itself. In his final days, he ordered the mirror sealed beneath the foundation stones, there to remain until such time as the family should have need of its revelations or wisdom, enough to wield it safely. Miss Ashworth had approached, and now stood looking over Holmes's shoulder at the ancient text. "My uncle mentioned finding documents in the sealed chamber along with the mirror," she said softly. "Papers in Lord Marcus's own hand, describing his travels in the Ottoman Empire, his meetings with Sufi mystics and scholars of Jewish Kabbalah, Christian Gnostics, and practitioners of traditions far older than any of these. He sought to create an instrument that would reveal divine truth, that would strip away illusion and show the eternal verities that lie beneath the shifting surface of mortal existence. Instead, Holmes said, rising and brushing dust from his knees, he created something that revealed more than he had bargained for. A mirror that shows not merely what we hide from others, but what we hide from ourselves. And perhaps, if the professor's theories are correct, a window into realms beyond our ordinary perception. I found myself drawn once again to the mirror's surface, compelled by a curiosity I could not entirely explain. My own reflection stared back, but now I began to notice subtle differences, small discrepancies between the Watson who stood in the tower and the Watson who gazed out from the obsidian depths. The reflected Watson seemed wearier, perhaps, or was it younger? The lines around the eyes were different. The set of the shoulders altered in some way I could not quite articulate. "Do you see it, Watson?" Holmes asked, appearing suddenly at my side. "The way it shows us, not as we are in this moment, but as we exist across time, past and present and possible futures, all overlaid upon one another, visible to those with eyes trained to perceive such things." Before I could answer, a sound reached us from somewhere within the house, distant but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and measured, climbing the spiral staircase that led to this tower room. We all heard it, all turned toward the door, which we had left slightly ajar. The footsteps grew closer, each one distinct, deliberate, accompanied by a soft dragging sound, as if the walker leaned heavily upon a cane or walking stick. Miss Ashworth's hand found my arm, her grip tight with sudden fear. "The servants have all retired to their quarters on the far side of the house," she whispered. "There should be no one in this wing at this hour." The footsteps reached the landing outside the door. We waited, frozen in that peculiar paralysis that grips the mind when confronted with the inexplicable, the impossible. The door, which had been open perhaps 6 inches, began to swing wider, its ancient hinges creaking softly in the silence. But the doorway, when it stood fully open, revealed nothing. The landing beyond was empty, lit only by the guttering candles in their iron sconces, showing stone walls and the top of the spiral staircase descending into darkness. No figure stood there, no walker with cane or stick, no explanation for the sounds we had all clearly heard. Holmes stepped forward, examining the doorway closely, running his fingers along the frame, testing the hinges. "A draught, perhaps," he murmured, though his tone suggested he found this explanation as unsatisfactory as I did. "These old towers are full of currents and eddies, air moving through cracks in the masonry, creating sounds that seem to have no source." Yet even as he spoke, I saw his eyes drift back to the mirror, to that dark surface that promised revelation and threatened madness in equal measure, and I knew that he, like the rest of us, had felt the presence of something in that moment, something that walked the border between the world we knew and the world the mirror revealed, something that moved in the spaces between what was and what might be, drawn perhaps by our presence here, our investigation of mysteries that had been deliberately concealed for generations. The moon outside had risen higher now, its light flooding the tower room with a brilliance that made the candles seem dim by comparison. And in that silver radiance, the obsidian mirror began to glow with a faint luminescence of its own, as if responding to the celestial body that Lord Marcus's documents had warned against, as if preparing to reveal secrets that the dawn might make us wish we had never witnessed. The luminescence spread across the mirror's surface, like frost forming on winter glass. Patterns of light that seemed to emanate from deep within the obsidian itself, rather than reflecting the moon's borrowed radiance. We stood transfixed, 3 witnesses to a phenomenon that defied every principle of natural philosophy, watching as the dark stone transformed into something alive, something aware, something that pulsed with a rhythm not unlike a heartbeat, slow and eternal and terribly patient. Holmes moved closer, his scientific curiosity overcoming whatever primitive instinct whispered warnings in the back of his mind. He withdrew a small magnifying glass from his pocket, that constant companion of his investigations, and began to examine the glowing symbols carved into the frame with meticulous attention. I could see his lips moving as he catalogued each mark, each curve and angle, committing them to the remarkable filing cabinet of his memory for later analysis and comparison. "Fascinating," he murmured, his breath misting in the cold air that seemed to emanate from the mirror itself, as if the object were drawing heat from the room, from our very bodies, using it to fuel whatever strange process had been initiated by the moon's alignment. These symbols are not merely decorative, Watson. They form a sequence, a progression. See here how this mark connects to this one, and this to the next. It is almost mathematical in its precision, like a formula written in a language that predates numbers themselves. Miss Ashworth had wrapped her arms around herself, whether from cold or fear I could not determine, but she did not retreat from the mirror's presence. Instead, she seemed drawn forward, as if some invisible thread connected her to the obsidian surface, pulling gently but inexorably. "My uncle's notes mentioned that the mirror responded to bloodlines," she said quietly, her eyes reflecting the strange light, "that those descended from Lord Marcus would see more clearly than others, would have access to visions denied to those outside the family." As if in response to her words, the glow intensified, and within the mirror's depths, shapes began to form. At first, they were indistinct, mere suggestions of movement in darkness, like fish swimming in deep water, visible only as flickers of silver against black. But gradually, they gained definition, became more solid, more present, until we could make out distinct forms, figures in period dress, moving through spaces that seemed to exist within the mirror's impossible geography. I saw a ballroom, candles blazing in crystal chandeliers, ladies in elaborate gowns, dancing with gentlemen in formal attire. The scene rendered in shades of silver and shadow, silent as a photograph, yet moving with the fluid grace of living memory. The ballroom faded, replaced by a library where a man who could only be Lord Marcus himself sat hunched over a desk, writing furiously, his face illuminated by candlelight. His expression one of fierce concentration, mixed with something that might have been dread. "It is showing us the past," Miss Ashworth whispered, her voice filled with wonder and trepidation. "The history of the house, of the family. Look, there, in the corner of that room. Is that not the same desk that stands here now? And those books behind Lord Marcus, surely some of them still line these very shelves." Holmes had produced his notebook and was sketching rapidly, capturing the scenes as they appeared and dissolved, his artist's hand translating 3-dimensional visions into 2-dimensional records with remarkable speed and accuracy. "Not merely showing," he corrected gently, "but remembering. The mirror absorbs, records, preserves. Every person who has ever stood before it, every event that has transpired in its presence, all stored somehow within the crystalline structure of the obsidian, accessible under the right conditions. The scene shifted again, and now we saw Professor Edmund Ashworth himself, younger than in his final days, standing before the mirror much as we stood now, his hand reaching out to touch its surface. The reflected Ashworth's lips moved, speaking words we could not hear, and then his hand made contact with the glass. The vision rippled like water, disturbed by a stone, and when it cleared, the professor was gone. But something else remained, a darkness within the mirror that seemed deeper than before, a void that suggested not absence, but presence, something waiting, watching, patient as stone and twice as old. A sound broke through our absorption, a book falling from one of the upper shelves, tumbling end over end through the air to land with a heavy thump on the floor near Miss Ashworth's feet. She bent to retrieve it, and I saw her hands trembling as she opened it to the page where it had naturally fallen. The text was in Latin, but illuminated with an illustration that made her gasp aloud. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely steady, "you must see this." Holmes joined her, holding his candle close to illuminate the page. The illustration depicted the obsidian mirror, but surrounding it were figures arranged in a circle, their hands joined, their faces upturned, as if in supplication or prayer. Above the mirror hung a symbol I did not recognize, something like an eye within a triangle, with rays of light emanating from it in all directions. "The Ritual of Revelation," Holmes read, translating the caption beneath the image. "Performed on the night of the full moon, when the veil between worlds grows thin. Those who seek truth must stand in judgment, not only of others, but of themselves, for the mirror shows all, conceals nothing, and what is revealed cannot be unseen." He paused, his finger tracing the Latin text that continued below. It goes on to describe a ceremony, a process by which one might use the mirror to commune with those who have passed beyond death's threshold, to seek counsel from ancestors, or to gain knowledge of futures yet to unfold. But it warns. His voice grew grave. It warns that such knowledge comes at a price, that truth untempered by mercy can shatter the mind that beholds it, that some doors, once opened, lead to places from which return is not guaranteed. The wind outside had reached nearly gale force now, howling around the tower like something alive and angry, battering at the windows with fists of air and rain that had begun to fall, heavy drops that struck glass like pebbles, thrown by an invisible hand. The candles flickered and swayed in draughts that found their way through cracks in the ancient stonework, and shadows danced across walls lined with the accumulated knowledge of centuries. I found my gaze drawn once more to the mirror's glowing surface, and this time I saw something that made my heart stutter in my chest. Among the shifting images, among the scenes of past and present flowing like water, I saw a face I recognized, my own, but not as I was in that moment. This Watson was older, his hair gone completely grey, sitting in a chair by a fireside, writing in a journal. The scene was so clear, so detailed, that I could make out individual words on the page. The adventure of the Obsidian mirror, written in my own hand, and a date that was yet 3 years hence. "Holmes," I said, my voice strange to my own ears, "I think I am seeing the future. My future. I am writing about this very case, this very night, but years from now." Holmes was beside me instantly, his keen eyes studying my reflection, seeing what I saw, or a possible future. He corrected softly. Remember, Watson, the professor's theory suggested the mirror shows not what will be, but what might be, probabilities rather than certainties. The future is not fixed, my friend, but fluid, changing with every choice we make, every path we choose to walk or decline. Miss Ashworth had approached the mirror from another angle, and suddenly she cried out, not in fear, but in recognition, in a joy so sharp it bordered on pain. "My father," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I can see my father in the mirror. He died when I was 12, but there he is, looking just as I remember him, and he is smiling at me, reaching out his hand as if to touch my face." I turned to look where she indicated, and saw indeed a man in the mirror's depths, dressed in the style of 20 years past, his features bearing a strong resemblance to Miss Ashworth's own. His lips moved, forming words, and though we could hear no sound, Miss Ashworth seemed to understand, seemed to be engaged in a silent conversation with the image of her departed father, her own lips forming responses, her expression transforming from grief to something approaching peace. Holmes watched this exchange with an expression I had rarely seen on his usually impassive face, a mixture of scientific fascination and something deeper, something almost like compassion, as if he understood that whatever we might think about the mechanisms behind these visions, for Miss Ashworth in this moment, the experience was profoundly real, profoundly meaningful. "The mirror adapts," he said quietly, speaking more to himself than to us. "It shows each observer what they most need to see, or perhaps what they most fear to see. Truth filtered through the lens of personal significance, revelation tailored to the individual mind." As if to test this theory, Holmes stepped directly before the mirror, positioning himself so that his reflection filled the central portion of the dark glass. For a long moment, nothing happened, and then the surface began to shift, to reorganize itself, patterns flowing and reforming like oil on water. What emerged was not Holmes as he stood before the mirror, but Holmes transformed. I saw him as a young man, intensity burning in eyes not yet tempered by experience. Then as an old man, ancient and frail, sitting alone in darkness. Then as something else entirely, a figure of pure logic and reason, stripped of flesh, existing as pure thought, pure deduction, a mind without the limitations of body or emotion. And behind all these versions of himself, I saw a shadow, a darkness that seemed to follow him through all his transformations, something that might have been doubt or despair, or simply the weight of seeing too clearly, of understanding too much, of bearing knowledge that others could not share or comprehend. Holmes stared at his multiplied reflections for what seemed an eternity, his face unreadable, his breathing shallow and controlled. Then, with a visible effort of will, he stepped back from the mirror, breaking the connection, and I saw that his hands were trembling slightly, though whether from cold or from whatever he had witnessed in that dark glass, I could not say. "Enough," he said, his voice rough, strained. "We have seen what the mirror offers, glimpsed its power and its purpose. But Miss Ashworth is correct to be cautious. This is not a toy for idle curiosity, but a tool of terrible potency, one that should be approached with respect and considerable care." The moon outside had reached its zenith, and in its full light, the mirror blazed with an intensity that was almost painful to behold. Yet even as we watched, the glow began to fade, the visions within the obsidian depths growing dim and indistinct, as if whatever force had animated the mirror was withdrawing, returning to dormancy until the next alignment of moon and stone and human consciousness would call it forth once more. Miss Ashworth had stepped back from the mirror, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears still tracking down her face, but her expression was one of gratitude, of closure. Whatever she had experienced in her silent communion with her father's image had brought her something she needed, some message or reassurance that had been denied her for 18 years. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether she spoke to us, or to the mirror itself, or to forces beyond our comprehension, I could not determine. "Thank you for letting me see him one last time, for letting me say goodbye properly." Holmes had returned to the professor's desk and was carefully gathering the papers and journals we would need for further study, moving with the methodical precision that was his hallmark, already organizing the evidence, planning the next steps of his investigation. But I noticed he did not look back at the mirror, did not allow his gaze to be drawn once more to that seductive surface that promised revelation at the price of certainty, understanding at the cost of peace. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no rest. Fame, brought no rest. I found myself drifting through dreams populated by mirrors and moonlight, by faces half remembered, and voices that whispered in languages I had never learned yet somehow understood. When I woke, the grey light of dawn was filtering through the heavy curtains of my room, and I could hear rain drumming steadily against the window panes. That persistent Northumberland rain that seems capable of lasting for days without pause or diminishment. I rose and dressed, my muscles stiff from the previous night's tension, my mind still processing the extraordinary visions we had witnessed in the tower. The house was quiet around me, that particular stillness that comes in the hours just after sunrise, when even the servants have not yet begun their daily routines, and the building itself seems to be gathering strength for the day ahead. I made my way down the corridor toward the room that had been set aside for our use as a temporary study, hoping to find Holmes already at work, for I knew his habits well enough to suspect that sleep had been as elusive for him as it had been for me. I was not disappointed. Holmes sat at a broad table near the window, still wearing the same clothes from the previous evening, surrounded by a landscape of opened books and scattered papers that suggested he had not retired at all. A lamp burned low beside him, its light supplemented now by the grey dawn, and he was bent over Professor Ashworth's journals with a magnifying glass, making notations in his own careful hand, cross-referencing passages, building the invisible architecture of understanding that would eventually reveal the truth behind the mystery. He looked up at my entrance, his face showing the signs of sleeplessness, but his eyes bright with that peculiar energy that always accompanied his deepest intellectual engagements. "Ah, Watson, good. I was hoping you would wake soon. I have made several discoveries during the night that I believe you will find illuminating." I poured myself coffee from the pot that someone, perhaps Holmes himself, or possibly an early rising servant, had prepared, and settled into a chair across from him. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what I needed to chase away the lingering shadows of troubled dreams. Outside, the rain continued its monotonous percussion, turning the gardens below into a watercolour study in greys and dark greens. The professor was more systematic in his research than his final entries might suggest, Holmes began, turning one of the journals so I could see the pages. In the earlier months of his investigation, he maintained detailed records of every experiment he conducted with the mirror, every condition he varied, every result he observed, Temperature, humidity, phase of the moon, time of day, his own emotional and physical state, all meticulously documented. He flipped through several pages, showing me charts and diagrams, sketches of the mirror from various angles, notes written in multiple coloured inks to denote different categories of observation. What emerges from this data is a pattern. The mirror's activity increases with the approach of the full moon, reaching its peak when the moon is at its fullest and highest in the sky. But there are other factors as well. Strong emotional states in the observer amplify the effect. Family connection to the Ashworths creates a stronger resonance. And most intriguingly, the mirror seems to respond to questions, to the focused intention of the viewer. I leaned forward, studying the pages with growing interest. You mean it is not simply showing random visions, but responding to what the observer seeks? A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a small shower of sparks, and I realized that Holmes must have kept the fire burning throughout the night. Another small detail that spoke to his complete absorption in the investigation. He rose and moved to warm his hands before the flames, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "There is more," he said, still gazing into the fire. The professor discovered that the mirror does not merely show the past or possible futures. It can reveal hidden truths about the present, things that exist but are concealed from ordinary perception. Secret rooms, buried documents, lies and deceptions all become transparent when viewed through the obsidian surface. It is, in effect, the ultimate detective's tool, a means of seeing through every disguise, every false front, every carefully constructed fiction. Then why, I asked, did he seal it away? Why did Lord Marcus before him deem it too dangerous to remain accessible? Holmes turned from the fire, and I saw in his expression something I had not expected: uncertainty, perhaps even a trace of fear. Because, Watson, there are some truths that human beings are not meant to bear. The professor's later entries make this clear. As he used the mirror more frequently, as he delved deeper into its revelations, he began to see not only the hidden aspects of the world around him, but the hidden aspects of himself. Every petty motivation, every small cruelty, every moment of cowardice or selfishness, all reflected back with perfect clarity, undeniable and unforgiving. He picked up another journal, one I had not seen before, smaller and more worn than the others. This is his private diary, kept separately from his research notes. In it, he chronicles his psychological deterioration as the mirror stripped away the comforting illusions by which all of us navigate our daily lives. He saw himself as he truly was, saw the gap between the man he believed himself to be and the man he actually was, and it nearly destroyed him. Before I could respond, a knock at the door interrupted us. Miss Ashworth entered, looking pale but composed, dressed in a simple morning gown, her hair arranged with less care than the previous evening, giving her a softer, more vulnerable appearance. She carried a tray bearing fresh tea and toast, which she set upon the table with a small smile. "I thought you gentlemen might benefit from some sustenance," she said. "Mrs. Garrett tells me Mr. Holmes has been working through the night. That cannot be good for the constitution, surely." Holmes accepted a cup of tea with a murmur of thanks, and I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he raised it to his lips, fatigue finally asserting itself despite his formidable will. Miss Ashworth settled into a chair near the fire, her own cup cradled in her hands, steam rising in delicate spirals before her face. "I must apologize for my emotional display last night," she said quietly. "Seeing my father, or the image of my father, it quite overcame me. I hope I did not compromise your investigation with my sentimentality." "Not at all," I assured her quickly. "It was a profoundly moving experience, and entirely understandable given the circumstances. Holmes, in fact, has been explaining to me the nature of the mirror's power, how it responds to the viewer's emotional and intellectual state." "Indeed," Holmes added, setting down his teacup. "Your reaction provides valuable data, Miss Ashworth. It confirms the professor's hypothesis that family connection enhances the mirror's effects. What you experienced was likely a combination of actual recorded memory, the mirror preserving moments from your father's life, and your own deep emotional need to reconnect with him, shaping what the mirror chose to reveal." "The mirror showed you something true," Holmes said carefully. "Though, whether it was truth about the past, or truth about your own heart, or some combination of both, that is more difficult to determine. The boundaries become blurred when dealing with an instrument that operates at the intersection of physical properties and human consciousness." The rain outside intensified, wind driving it against the windows in gusts that made the glass rattle in its frames. The room grew darker as clouds gathered, and Holmes rose to adjust the lamp, bringing more light to chase away the gloom. As he did so, a piece of paper that had been resting on the edge of the table was caught by a draught and fluttered to the floor. Miss Ashworth bent to retrieve it, but as her fingers touched the paper, she froze, her face going white. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this drawing, where did you find it?" Holmes crossed to her side, looking down at the paper she held with trembling hands. It was a sketch, rendered in pencil, showing a section of the hall's grounds that I did not recognize. A small clearing surrounded by standing stones, with what appeared to be a stone altar or table at its center. "It was tucked into the back of one of the professor's journals," Holmes replied. "Why? Do you recognize the location?" "It is the old ritual site," Miss Ashworth said, her voice gaining strength, though her hands still shook. "On the eastern edge of the estate, perhaps a mile from the house. The standing stones are ancient, predating even the earliest records of the property. Local folklore claims they were used by druids for ceremonies, though my uncle believed they might be older still, remnants of some forgotten culture that left no written records of their existence." She looked up at Holmes, her green eyes wide with a realization that clearly disturbed her. "But the altar in this drawing, that was not there when I last visited the site 3 months ago. If my uncle erected it, if he was performing rituals there in addition to his work with the mirror." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Holmes took the drawing from her, studying it with intense concentration. "When did you last see your uncle alive, Miss Ashworth? Before his death, I mean." 6 weeks ago," she replied. "I came for a brief visit, stayed only 2 days. He seemed distracted, distant, but I attributed it to his research. He had always been somewhat absent-minded when deep in his studies, and he gave no indication of having performed any ceremonies or rituals, made no mention of the standing stones." Miss Ashworth shook her head. "None whatsoever. Our conversations were brief and superficial. I had the impression he was counting the hours until my departure, eager to return to his work without the distraction of social obligation." Holmes returned to the table and began sorting through the papers with renewed urgency. searching for something specific among the accumulated documents. There must be more. If the professor was conducting rituals at the stone circle, he would have documented them, prepared for them, recorded the results. Watson, help me search for any references to the standing stones, to outdoor ceremonies, to anything beyond the mirror itself. We spent the next hour going through every scrap of paper, every notation in every journal, while the rain continued its assault on the windows and the fire burned lower in the grate. Miss Ashworth watched us work, occasionally rising to add another log to the fire or refresh our tea, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the minutes passed without discovery. It was she who finally found it, a letter tucked into a book on one of the shelves, written in the professor's hand but never sent, addressed to no one, or perhaps to himself. She read it aloud, her voice growing fainter as the content became more disturbing. I have attempted the ritual of convergence as described in the texts recovered from beneath the foundation. The mirror alone is insufficient. It shows but does not grant passage. The standing stones, however, when aligned with the mirror's power under the full moon, create a threshold, a doorway between what is and what might be. Tonight I shall step through, shall cross from shadow into light, from ignorance into knowledge. If I do not return, let this serve as warning to those who might follow. Some boundaries exist for purpose, and to cross them is to risk everything we believe ourselves to be. The letter ended there, unsigned, undated, a message from a man preparing to take a step from which he suspected there might be no return. Miss Ashworth set it down on the table with exaggerated care, as if it might shatter at rough handling, and looked at Holmes with eyes that pleaded for reassurance, for some rational explanation that would make sense of her uncle's final desperate gambit. Rain transformed the Landsyn, transformed the landscape into something primordial, stripping away the veneer of civilization until the estate grounds resembled nothing so much as the wild moorland that surrounded them, untamed and indifferent to human concerns. By mid-morning, Holmes had made his decision. We would venture to the standing stones, would examine this ritual site that had occupied the professor's final thoughts, would follow the thread of investigation wherever it might lead, regardless of weather or comfort, or the warnings implicit in that unsent letter. Miss Ashworth insisted on accompanying us, despite Holmes's gentle suggestion that she might prefer to remain at the hall. "This is my family's legacy," she said firmly, wrapping herself in a heavy cloak. "My uncle's mystery to unravel. I will not hide indoors, while you gentlemen face whatever truths await us in that ancient place." There was steel beneath her quiet demeanour, a determination that reminded me of women I had known who had faced far worse than rain and standing stones without flinching. We equipped ourselves for the expedition as if preparing for a military campaign. Waterproof coats and sturdy boots, lanterns though it was daylight, rope and tools whose purposes I did not question, for Holmes had a gift for anticipating needs before they became apparent. Miss Ashworth provided us with a detailed map of the estate, her finger tracing the path we would take through the eastern woods to where the stones had stood for millennia, patient witnesses to the passage of countless human dramas. The kitchen provided us with provisions wrapped in oilcloth, bread and cheese, and flasks of hot tea that Mrs. Garrett pressed into our hands with warnings about the treacherous footing on the eastern slopes and dark mutterings about places best left undisturbed. She was a woman of perhaps 60 years, her face weathered by decades of Northumberland winters, and her eyes held the particular wariness of those who have lived long enough to respect the inexplicable. We departed through a side entrance, stepping from the warmth and light of the hall into the grey embrace of the storm. The rain was not the gentle patter of London showers, but something more aggressive, drops heavy enough to sting exposed skin, driven nearly horizontal by wind that seemed determined to push us back toward shelter. The world contracted to a radius of perhaps 50 feet, everything beyond that distance obscured by veils of water and mist that shifted and swirled with hypnotic irregularity. Miss Ashworth led the way with the confidence of one who had walked these paths since childhood, her cloak billowing behind her like dark wings as she navigated between ancient oaks whose branches creaked and groaned overhead. Holmes followed close behind, his keen eyes scanning the landscape despite the limited visibility, cataloguing details, noting landmarks, building his mental map of the terrain. I brought up the rear, one hand resting on the medical bag I had thought to bring, old military habits dying hard, always prepared for injury or mishap. The path took us through gardens gone wild with neglect, ornamental plants and native flora intermingling until the distinction between cultivated and natural had blurred into irrelevance. We passed a fountain where stone cherubs poured water that mixed indistinguishably with rain, their carved smiles eroded by centuries of weather into expressions more unsettling than joyful. Beyond that lay a hedge maze, its walls grown tall and thick, and I found myself grateful we were not venturing into that particular labyrinth, for something about its shadowed passages spoke of secrets better left undiscovered. The woods began abruptly, the transition from open ground to forest, marked by a line of massive oaks that must have been old when the hall was first built. Beneath their canopy, the rain's assault diminished somewhat, filtered through layers of bare branches that caught and redirected the water into streams that ran down trunks like tears on ancient faces. The ground beneath our feet grew soft, mulch and leaf litter forming a carpet that muffled our footsteps until we seemed to move through the forest like ghosts, insubstantial and silent. Holmes paused at one point to examine marks on a tree trunk, scratches in the bark that might have been made by deer or might have been something else entirely. He said nothing, but I saw him make a notation in the small waterproof notebook he carried, and we pressed on, deeper into woods that grew darker despite the morning hour, as if the trees themselves conspired to hold back the light. Time became difficult to judge beneath that heavy canopy. We might have walked for 20 minutes or an hour when we emerged into a clearing, and I felt the peculiar disorientation that comes from suddenly having the sky visible overhead once more. The rain struck us with renewed force, but my attention was immediately captured by what stood before us. 7 stones, each perhaps 10 feet in height, arranged in a rough circle around a central area where the grass had been cleared away to reveal bare earth. The stones were of a dark grey rock, mottled with lichen that created patterns almost like writing, almost like the symbols we had seen on the obsidian mirror's frame. They leaned at slight angles, as if they had been standing so long that the earth beneath them had settled unevenly, or as if some force had pushed at them from within the circle, trying to escape, or perhaps trying to enter from some dimension beyond our ordinary perception. At the center of the circle stood the altar from the professor's drawing, and seeing it in reality rather than pencil sketch sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the rain. It was a single slab of dark stone, roughly rectangular, supported by smaller stones at each corner. The surface bore stains that might have been from rust or mineral deposits, or from substances I preferred not to contemplate. Around the altar, marks had been scratched or painted into the earth, forming a pattern that echoed the arrangement of symbols on the mirror's frame. Miss Ashworth had stopped at the edge of the circle, her face pale beneath the hood of her cloak. "He actually did it," she whispered. "Built an altar, performed rituals. My uncle, a man of science and reason, reduced to this primitive superstition." Holmes had no such hesitation. He stepped across the invisible boundary marked by the standing stones and approached the altar with the careful attention of a physician examining a patient. He circled it slowly, studying it from every angle, occasionally crouching to examine the marks on the ground more closely, his fingers tracing patterns in the air as if reading messages written in invisible ink. "Not superstition," he corrected absently, his focus entirely on the altar. "Experimentation." The professor was applying scientific method to phenomena that science has traditionally dismissed. These marks, these arrangements, they represent hypotheses being tested, variables being controlled, results being documented. He paused, pointing to a series of notches carved into the altar's edge. "See here, these are measurement marks, precise and deliberate." He was recording something, tracking some change or progression. I joined him within the circle, feeling as I crossed that threshold a subtle shift in the air, a change in pressure or temperature, or perhaps something less tangible, some alteration in the very quality of space itself. The rain seemed to fall differently here, the drops hanging suspended for a fraction of a second longer than they should, creating a curtain of water that surrounded us like a cocoon. At that moment, as if the weather itself had been waiting for us to gather in this ancient place, thunder rolled across the sky, distant but massive, a sound that seemed to originate not above, but below, rising from the earth itself. Miss Ashworth gasped and stumbled backward, her foot catching on a root, and she would have fallen had I not moved quickly to steady her. As I did so, my hand brushed against one of the standing stones, and I felt a vibration, a thrumming that travelled up my arm and seemed to resonate in my very bones. "Holmes," I said, my voice strange to my own ears. "The stones are humming. I can feel it, like standing next to a great bell that has just been struck." He placed his own hand against the nearest stone, his expression intensifying with concentration. "Yes," he confirmed. "Some property of the rock, perhaps, or the way these stones are positioned, creating a resonance chamber that responds to atmospheric pressure, to the electrical charge in storm clouds. Or," he paused, his scientific certainty wavering for just a moment, "or something else entirely, some function we do not yet understand, some purpose these stones were designed to serve by builders whose knowledge has been lost to time." Miss Ashworth had recovered her composure, and now stood examining the altar from a safe distance outside the circle. "There are objects here," she called, pointing to items I had not noticed, partially concealed by the altar's shadow. "Books, candles, what appears to be a mirror, though much smaller than the one in the tower." Holmes was beside them in an instant, carefully lifting each item, handling them with the delicacy of an archaeologist uncovering precious artifacts. The books were the professor's journals, their leather bindings swollen with rain damage, despite having been wrapped in oilcloth. The candles were thick and black, their wax hardened into shapes that suggested they had been lit and allowed to burn for many hours. And the mirror, yes, it was indeed a mirror, perhaps the size of a dinner plate, its frame carved from the same obsidian as its larger counterpart in the tower, its surface reflecting the grey sky and our faces with that same unsettling quality of showing more than should be possible. "He brought elements of the tower here," Holmes murmured, arranging the objects on the altar's surface, as if recreating the professor's final ritual. Created a sympathetic resonance, perhaps, linking this site to the mirror in the hall, using the standing stones to amplify whatever effect the obsidian produces. The full moon would provide the necessary celestial alignment, the storm the electrical charge, and his own focused intention the final component required to... He trailed off, unwilling or unable to complete the thought. I had been examining the ground around the altar, and now called out, my voice urgent. "Holmes, Miss Ashworth, look at this." I pointed to marks in the earth, clearly visible, despite the rain trying to wash them away. Footprints, but strangely distorted, as if the person who made them had been walking in two directions simultaneously, or as if the earth itself had been confused about which impression to retain. And beyond the footprints, leading away from the circle toward the woods on the far side, was something else. A trail of disturbance in the vegetation, plants bent and broken as if something heavy had passed through them, dragging itself along the ground. But the trail did not extend beyond perhaps 20 feet before it simply stopped, as if whatever had made it had vanished into thin air or been lifted bodily from the earth. Holmes followed the trail to its termination point, kneeling in the mud, heedless of the rain soaking through his clothes. He remained there for several minutes, perfectly still, his mind working through possibilities, eliminating the impossible, considering the improbable. When he finally rose and returned to where Miss Ashworth and I waited, his expression was troubled in a way I had seldom seen. "The professor came here on the night of the full moon," he said slowly, working through the deduction as he spoke. "He performed his ritual, whatever it entailed, using the stones and the altar and the smaller mirror to create some kind of gateway, threshold, point of crossing. And then he either left this place by means we cannot explain, or..." He paused, choosing his words with unusual care. "Or he succeeded in his stated goal of crossing from one state of being to another, and what we found collapsed in the tower was merely the shell he left behind, the physical form no longer needed by a consciousness that had transcended its material limitations." Miss Ashworth made a small sound of distress, and I put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Surely, Holmes," I said, "you cannot be suggesting that the professor literally passed into some other dimension, some realm beyond our physical world." "I am suggesting nothing, Watson. I am merely observing that the evidence before us admits of no conventional explanation. The footprints, the trail, the items left here, as if abandoned mid-ritual, all indicate something occurred here that falls outside the parameters of normal human experience." Thunder rolled again, closer this time, and with it came a shift in the wind that sent the rain suddenly horizontal, driving it into our faces with stinging force. One of the lanterns we had brought flickered and went out, its flame extinguished by a gust that seemed to come from the very centre of the stone circle, rushing outward like breath expelled from giant lungs. "We should return to the hall," Miss Ashworth said, raising her voice to be heard over the wind. "This storm is worsening, and we have learned what we came to learn, have we not?" Holmes gathered the professor's journals and the small mirror, wrapping them carefully in oilcloth, and we prepared to depart. But as we turned to retrace our steps through the woods, I glanced back at the standing stones and saw something that made me freeze. A figure, barely visible through the rain, standing within the circle where moments before there had been no one. It appeared to be watching us, its form indistinct but undeniably present, and for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, our eyes met across the distance. Then Miss Ashworth called my name, breaking the spell, and when I looked again, the figure was gone, if it had ever truly been there at all. I said nothing of what I had seen, uncertain whether to trust my own perception, wondering if the storm and the strange atmosphere of that place had conjured phantoms from suggestion and shadow. We made our way back through the woods in silence, each lost in private thoughts, the weight of what we had discovered pressing down upon us like the leaden sky above. Warmth had never felt so precious as it did when we finally stumbled through the hall's great doors, shedding our sodden cloaks in the entrance hall, where a fire roared in welcome, flames leaping and crackling as if in celebration of our safe return. Mrs. Garrett appeared with startling swiftness, tutting over our bedraggled state, dispatching servants to bring hot baths and dry clothes, pressing cups of mulled wine into our trembling hands, with the firmness of one who will brook no argument. The contrast between the wild exposure of the standing stones and this sanctuary of civilization was so profound that for several minutes I simply stood before the fire, letting heat seep back into my bones, watching steam rise from my wet clothing like spirits departing a body. Holmes had immediately sequestered himself with the materials we had retrieved from the ritual site, spreading the waterlogged journals across a table in the library, where additional fires had been lit to combat the pervasive chill. Even soaked, even damaged by exposure to the elements, the professor's handwriting remained legible, his final thoughts preserved as if by some miracle of determination, ink clinging to paper despite water's best efforts to wash away all traces of human meaning. I found him there an hour later, after I had bathed and changed into dry clothes that one of the servants had pressed and warmed before the fire. He sat hunched over the journals, a magnifying glass in one hand, turning pages with the delicate touch of a surgeon operating on living tissue. The small obsidian mirror rested beside him, its dark surface reflecting the firelight in ways that seemed to defy the normal behavior of reflected flame. The light bending around invisible obstacles, creating patterns that appeared almost intentional, almost purposeful. "The final entries," Holmes said, without looking up, his voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "Written in the days immediately before his death. Watson, he was not attempting to communicate with the dead or peer into futures yet to unfold. His goal was far more radical, far more dangerous than mere divination." I settled into a chair opposite him, accepting a fresh cup of tea from a servant who appeared and disappeared with the silent efficiency that spoke of excellent training. The tea was Earl Grey, fragrant with bergamot, and I wrapped my hands around the cup's warmth, while Holmes continued his explanation. Professor Ashworth believed that consciousness, the essential self that we think of as I, does not reside solely in the physical brain, but exists as a kind of field, a pattern of energy that extends beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone. The mirror, he theorized, was designed to make this extended consciousness visible, to show us our own thoughts and memories and possibilities made manifest in obsidian reflection. He paused to sip water from a glass at his elbow, his throat clearly irritated from speaking in the cold rain. But more than that, he believed that through intense focus and the proper alignment of natural forces, moon phases, electromagnetic fields, geological formations like those standing stones, one could use the mirror not merely to observe consciousness, but to project it, to send one's awareness beyond the confines of the physical body and into elsewhere. Astral projection, I said, remembering tales I had heard in India during my military service. Yogis claiming to send their spirits wandering while their bodies remained in meditation. You are saying he attempted to leave his body, to travel in spirit form? In essence, yes, though he would have objected to the mystical terminology. He saw it as a purely natural phenomenon, no more supernatural than the operation of a telegraph or telephone, merely utilizing principles science has not yet formulated into law. Holmes turned a page, revealing a diagram that showed the positioning of mirrors, stones, and human figures in geometric relationships. The ritual at the standing stones was meant to create optimal conditions for this projection. The large mirror in the tower serving as an anchor, a reference point, while the smaller mirror at the stones acted as a lens, focusing and directing consciousness outward. A log in the fireplace collapsed into embers, sending up a shower of sparks that danced briefly before winking out. And somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, 4 melodious notes that seemed to come from a great distance. The afternoon was drawing toward evening, I realized, the short November day already surrendering to encroaching darkness. Holmes looked up at me then, and I was struck by the weariness in his eyes, the weight of understanding that comes from staring too long into mysteries that resist resolution. That is one possibility. Another, more disturbing, is that he succeeded perfectly, that he projected his consciousness exactly as he intended. But what he found in that extended state so horrified or overwhelmed him that the shock of it stopped his heart. The body we found in the tower was not a man who had failed in his experiment, but one who had succeeded too well. Miss Ashworth entered the library at that moment, saving me from having to formulate a response to this unsettling theory. She had changed into a gown of deep blue that brought out the colour of her eyes, and her hair hung loose about her shoulders, still damp from her own bath, giving her a softness that contrasted with the steel I had witnessed during our expedition. She carried with her a wooden box, ornately carved, which she set upon the table between Holmes and myself. "I found this in my uncle's bedroom," she said quietly, "hidden in a compartment behind a loose panel. I think you should see what it contains." Holmes opened the box with care, revealing its contents. A stack of letters, yellowed with age, written in a hand different from the professor's, and beneath them a daguerreotype portrait of a woman whose face bore a striking resemblance to Miss Ashworth herself, though the clothing and styling marked the image as perhaps 60 years old. "My great-grandmother," Miss Ashworth explained, "Lydia Ashworth, She died in 1847 under circumstances that were never fully explained. Family legend says she went mad, that she was found wandering the grounds in her nightdress, speaking in tongues, claiming to have seen visions of the future and the past simultaneously. She was institutionalized and died there within the year. Holmes had begun reading the letters, his expression growing more intent with each page. "These are her writings," he said, "addressed to her husband, though it appears they were never sent. She describes experiences with the obsidian mirror remarkably similar to your uncle's, Watson. She, too, attempted to use it as a tool for extending consciousness, for perceiving realities beyond the ordinary senses. And she, too, found herself unable to reconcile what she witnessed with her sanity." He set the letters down gently, as if they were somehow fragile, despite their evident durability through decades of storage. "The mirror has been working on the Ashworth family for generations, not merely showing them visions, but calling to them, drawing them toward experiments that promise enlightenment, but deliver something far more ambiguous. It is as if the mirror itself has intent, has purpose, and uses those with the sensitivity to perceive its true nature as instruments of that purpose." "But purpose toward what end?" I asked, feeling a chill despite the fire's warmth. What could an inanimate object, however strange its properties, possibly seek to accomplish? Before Holmes could answer, the library door, which Miss Ashworth had left slightly ajar, swung fully open with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to require more force than any draught could provide. We all turned to look, half expecting to see a servant entering with more refreshments or firewood. But the doorway stood empty, revealing only the corridor beyond, lit by gas lamps that flickered as if troubled by unseen currents. And then we heard it. Footsteps, distant but distinct, coming from somewhere above us, from the direction of the tower where the great mirror waited in its circular room. Slow, measured steps, accompanied by that same dragging sound we had heard the previous night, as if the walker leaned heavily upon a support or dragged something behind them with each step. Miss Ashworth's hand found my arm, her grip tight enough to be painful. "The servants are all in the kitchen at this hour," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her obvious effort at control. "There should be no one in the tower." Holmes was already moving, lighting a candle from the fire, and heading toward the door with that decisive energy that came over him when action was required. "Then we shall investigate," he said simply, as if the matter were no more concerning than answering an unexpected knock at the door. "Come, both of you. I suspect we are about to receive the final piece of this puzzle, delivered by a messenger whose identity I believe I can now deduce." We followed him through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they had in daylight, past portraits whose subjects appeared to watch our passage, with expressions that might have been warning or encouragement, or simple curiosity about what fresh folly the living were about to commit. The footsteps above us continued their steady progression, neither hastening nor slowing, patient as eternity, moving with purpose towards some destination known only to the walker. The spiral staircase to the tower loomed before us, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of ascent and descent, and Holmes began to climb without hesitation, his candle casting wild shadows on the curved walls. Miss Ashworth and I followed, and I felt her trembling beside me, though whether from cold or fear or anticipation I could not say. We emerged into the tower study to find it transformed. The great mirror blazed with inner light, brighter than we had seen it the previous night, as if every bit of moonlight it had absorbed over centuries was being released at once. The symbols on its frame seemed to move, to flow like liquid across the obsidian surface, rearranging themselves into patterns that shifted faster than the eye could follow. And standing before the mirror, silhouetted against that impossible radiance, was a figure. It turned as we entered, and in the mirror's light, I could see features that belonged to no living person. A face that seemed to shift between young and old, male and female, familiar and strange, as if it were all people and no people simultaneously. When it spoke, the voice came not from its mouth, but from the mirror itself, resonating in the very air around us. At last, the voice said, warm and cold at once, welcoming and warning. At last, witnesses who come with eyes open rather than closed, with minds prepared to understand rather than flee. The guardian has been waiting, has been calling across the generations, seeking those who might complete what Lord Marcus began and could not finish. Holmes stepped forward, his candle flame steady, despite the strange currents in the room. Professor Ashworth, he said, and it was not a question, but a statement of fact. You succeeded in projecting your consciousness, but you did not return to your body. Instead, you remain here, sustained by the mirror, existing in the space between matter and energy, between living and dead. The figure inclined its head in acknowledgement, and as it did, I saw more clearly what it truly was. Not Professor Ashworth, not exactly, but something that had once been him, transformed by passage through the mirror into something both more and less than human, a consciousness without anchor, awareness without flesh. I learned the truth, it said, its voice filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to fill the room like water filling a vessel. The mirror does not reveal hidden truths about the world or about ourselves. It reveals that there is no singular truth, that every moment contains infinite possibilities, that consciousness creates reality rather than merely observing it. And that knowledge, that certainty of radical uncertainty, is more than the human mind was designed to bear. The consciousness that had been Professor Edmund Ashworth drifted closer to us, and I felt the temperature in the room and I felt the temperature in the room plummet, my breath misting in the air, frost beginning to form on the windows in patterns that resembled the symbols carved into the mirror's frame. Yet there was no menace in this presence, only a terrible sadness, the grief of one who has seen too much and can never unsee it, who has crossed thresholds that should have remained inviolate and now exists in permanent exile from the comfortable certainties that make mortal life bearable. Miss Ashworth had released my arm and moved forward, her initial fear transforming into something else entirely, a desperate need to communicate with this remnant of the uncle she had loved. "Is it truly you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Or are you some echo, some memory the mirror has preserved and animated?" The figure's form flickered, becoming more solid for a moment, and I could see Professor Ashworth, as he must have been in life, a man of perhaps 60 years, scholarly, with kind eyes behind spectacles, a gentle mouth accustomed to smiling. Then the image wavered again, becoming translucent, barely there. "I am what remains," it answered, and now the voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the room itself had learned to speak. Memory and awareness without the anchor of flesh. I tried to warn others through visions in the mirror, tried to prevent them from following the path I had taken. but the mirror's call is strong, and those with the gift to hear it are drawn inexorably toward the same fatal curiosity that consumed me. Holmes had been studying the mirror throughout this exchange, his scientific mind still working, even in the face of phenomena that defied scientific explanation. "You wish to understand the nature of consciousness," he said thoughtfully, "to prove that mind exists independent of matter, and you succeeded, but in doing so you trapped yourself between states, unable to fully return to material existence or fully transition to whatever lies beyond death." "Just so," the consciousness confirmed, and I heard in that voice such weariness that it made my heart ache. Lord Marcus understood this danger. He created the mirror as a philosophical instrument, a means of contemplating the nature of reality. But he never intended it to be used as I used it, never meant for anyone to actually attempt the crossing. The symbols on the frame are not merely decorative or functional. They are warnings, written in a language older than words, speaking directly to something deep in human consciousness that recognizes danger, even when the rational mind does not comprehend. The mirror's glow had begun to pulse now, rhythmic as a heartbeat, and with each pulse I felt a corresponding echo in my own chest, as if the mirror were trying to synchronize with the living hearts in the room, to establish some resonance that would allow it to communicate more directly. The books on the surrounding shelves trembled, their bindings creaking, and several volumes tumbled to the floor, falling open to pages that showed diagrams and illustrations of mirrors, eyes, windows, portals, all the ancient symbols humanity has used to represent the boundary between seen and unseen. "What can be done?" Miss Ashworth asked, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. "Is there a way to release you, to let you move on to whatever peace awaits? Or must you remain here forever, bound to this obsidian prison?" The consciousness moved toward the mirror, and as it approached, its reflection appeared in the dark surface, but inverted, reversed, as if mirror and consciousness were two halves of a whole that had been torn asunder. "There is a way," it said slowly, "but it requires understanding what the mirror truly is, what function it was designed to serve before Lord Marcus ever laid hands upon it, before it came to these shores from the distant lands where it was first fashioned." Holmes had pulled out his notebook and was writing rapidly, recording every word, but I noticed his hand shook slightly, the usually steady penmanship showing the strain of maintaining scientific objectivity in the face of the impossible. "Tell us," he urged, "whatever knowledge you have gained in your current state, whatever understanding you have achieved, we will listen." A gust of wind struck the tower with such force that the entire structure seemed to sway, and one of the narrow windows shattered, glass exploding inward in a spray of crystalline fragments that caught the mirror's light and scattered it across the room in 1,000 tiny rainbows. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of rain and wild moorland, grounding us in the physical world even as we discussed matters that transcended physicality. The consciousness seemed to draw strength from this intrusion of the natural world, becoming more substantial, more present. The mirror was created by a civilization that understood consciousness differently than we do. It began, its voice taking on the cadence of a lecturer addressing students, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of instruction. They knew that what we call the self is not singular but multiple, that we contain within us not only our present awareness, but the accumulated awareness of all our ancestors, all the lives that led to our existence. The mirror was designed to make this multiplicity visible, to allow communion between the living and those who came before. It gestured toward the obsidian surface, and images began to form there. Faces, hundreds of them, thousands, stretching back through time, all bearing some resemblance to Miss Ashworth's features, the genetic inheritance made visible, the chain of being rendered in light and shadow. But the mirror is more than a window into the past, the consciousness continued. It is a repository, a library of lives. Every person who has ever gazed into it with true understanding has left an imprint, a copy of themselves, their memories and knowledge and experiences preserved in the crystalline structure of the obsidian. I did not merely project my consciousness away from my body. I transferred it into the mirror itself, adding myself to the countless others who dwell within its depths. Miss Ashworth had gone pale, one hand pressed to her throat. Then when I saw my father in the mirror, I was not seeing a mere reflection or illusion, but his actual preserved consciousness. He truly was there. In a manner of speaking, the presence that had been Professor Ashworth replied gently, an exact copy of his mind as it existed in the moments he spent before the mirror, contemplating his own nature, his memories, his love for you. Not the original, perhaps, but no less real for being a copy, no less capable of thought and feeling and connection. Holmes had moved to examine the broken window, his practical nature asserting itself even in this moment of metaphysical revelation. He pulled heavy curtains across the shattered glass, blocking the wind and rain, then turned back to face the glowing mirror with an expression I had never seen on his features before. Not merely curiosity or determination, but a kind of hunger, a yearning for knowledge that went beyond his usual intellectual passion. Then the mirror is not dangerous in itself, he said slowly, working through the implications. The danger lies in using it without understanding, in seeking to leave one's body without realizing that the consciousness transferred into the mirror may not be able to return. Lord Marcus sealed it away, not because it was evil, but because humanity was not ready for what it offered. And may never be ready, the consciousness agreed, its form beginning to fade now, as if the effort of maintaining coherence and communication was draining whatever energy sustained it. For to fully accept what the mirror reveals is to surrender the illusion of singular identity, to acknowledge that we are not individuals, but nodes in a vast network of consciousness that extends backward to the origins of life itself, and forward to possibilities we cannot imagine. Most minds cannot bear that recognition and remain functional. A profound silence settled over the room, broken only by the sound of rain against the remaining windows, and the crackle of settling embers in a brazier that had burned down to coals. The mirror's glow was diminishing, returning to its normal state of dark reflection, and the consciousness before us was becoming increasingly transparent, increasingly abstract, as if our time for conversation was running out. "Uncle Edmund," Miss Ashworth said softly, tears streaming down her face, "what would you have us do? Seal the mirror away again? Destroy it? Try to free you from its depths?" The fading presence turned toward her one last time, and for a moment I saw clearly the face of the man she had known, the scholar who had loved his niece and sought understanding, even at the cost of everything he was. "Do not destroy it," he said urgently. Too much knowledge would be lost, too many voices silenced. But seal it, yes. Return it to the chamber beneath the foundation. Place it where it can harm no one, where it can wait for a time when humanity has evolved enough to use such tools wisely rather than rashly. He moved closer to Miss Ashworth, reaching out a hand that passed through hers without contact, but left her shivering as if she had been touched by something profoundly cold and profoundly warm simultaneously. And know this, dear child, what you saw of your father in the mirror was real. The love he bore you, the pride he felt in who you became, all that remains preserved and aware within the obsidian depths. You are not alone, Cordelia. You carry within you the love of all who came before, and that love endures beyond death, beyond time, beyond the boundaries we imagine separate the living from the dead. With those words, the consciousness of Professor Edmund Ashworth faded entirely, dispersing like morning mist before the sun, leaving us alone in the tower room with the now dormant mirror, reflecting nothing but our own stunned faces and the flickering light of Holmes's candle. The temperature began to rise immediately, frost melting from the windows, the oppressive cold lifting as if a door to winter had been closed. Miss Ashworth collapsed into a chair, sobbing quietly, and I went to her, offering what comfort I could, while Holmes stood before the mirror, staring into its depths with an expression of profound thoughtfulness. I knew that look, knew he was already planning, calculating, determining the steps we would need to take to fulfill the professor's final request. "Watson," he said at last, his voice steady but subdued, "we will need help. Strong backs to move this artifact, skilled hands to seal the chamber properly, and above all, discretion. This is not knowledge that should spread beyond these walls." I nodded agreement, my mind already turning to practical matters, to the logistics of moving something so large and heavy, to the precautions we would need to take to ensure the mirror's hiding place remained secure. But beneath these practical thoughts ran a current of deeper feeling, a recognition that we had witnessed something extraordinary, had stood at the intersection of science and mystery, and found them not opposed, but merely different facets of a reality far stranger and more wonderful than our daily lives suggested. The storm outside was beginning to abate, the wind's fury diminishing to a whisper, the rain softening to a gentle patter that spoke of endings and new beginnings. Dawn was still hours away, but I felt as if we had lived through an entire lifetime in this single night, had aged and been reborn in the span of these dark hours. Holmes began gathering the professor's journals and papers, organizing them with his characteristic precision, preserving the record of what had transpired, even as we prepared to hide away the instrument that had made such discoveries possible. Miss Ashworth had composed herself, and now moved to help him, her movements deliberate and calm, finding purpose in action, in the concrete tasks that would carry us through the remainder of this extraordinary night. And through it all, the obsidian mirror watched in silence, patient and eternal, holding within its dark depths the consciousness of countless souls, the accumulated wisdom and folly of all who had dared to gaze into its surface and ask the most fundamental of questions. What am I? Where do I come from? Where do I go? The answers it offered were not comfort, were not peace, but they were truth of a kind, and perhaps that was all any seeking soul could hope to find.